This is Limgrave. It's the first region of Elden Ring, with the game's doors opening ajar, if only briefly, for a network test ahead of its full release on 25th of February 2022. It's a generous slice too. It's huge, it's full of things to do, almost cruelly so given how, well, limited the test access times were. Limgrave is a flourishing, open-ended terrain filled with woodlands, castle ruins, and ravines to explore, with a perilous marshland at its centre. You choose one of 5 classes to start, the Enchanted Knight being our pick for a mixture of melee and magic, and then you're simply free to adventure the world in any direction, free to discover dungeons, to battle its many bosses as you please. All packed within a 6 to 9GB install, depending on your console of choice, it's a remarkable sample of developer From Software's next big project. It's also the first time we've seen this engine, an update on the one used in Sekiro, running on Xbox Series X, S and PlayStation 5 as a true native app. Visual comparisons are inbound, frame rates will be tested, and with a surprise way to get a locked 60fps too if you have the PS4 Pro version running on new PS5 hardware. More on that later. Regardless of which platform you choose though, Elden Ring is already looking set to impress. First, let's backtrack a bit. There's a lot in Elden Ring that's new territory for From Software, especially so in light of its work on Dark Souls or Bloodborne, where level design often funnels you from one intricate area to the next. Here, it's really an open book. A decaying world named The Lands Between is at its heart, with a backstory penned by, of course, Game of Thrones scribe George R.R. Martin. Every inch of its lore, every grotesque creature, the grasslands, the Stormhill walls, the golden tree looming over it all, every point is sumptuously realised, on a scale quite unlike anything we've seen from this engine, this studio. Grass draws in thick and far to the horizon, there's a day-night cycle, there's weather states including rain, storms, there's crafting, foraging, even an element of platforming with a new jump button. And to cover so much ground, of course, you're given a steed to ride very early on, complete with a nifty double jump. This freedom to adventure in any direction, to go anywhere, is unique. Freedom is the thing that defines Elden Ring most. A question before we start properly. Is Elden Ring still built for the most ardent Dark Souls fan? Is it still brutal in its difficulty, or does it actually also work as a good entry point for newcomers? For those who have never played a Soulsborne type of game before? The answer is a mixture of both. As an introduction to a From Software style world, there's never really been a better time to jump in. That holds for several reasons too. Firstly, and unlike Dark Souls, there's no mystery in where to go next. Your bearings are always set, thanks to rays of light guiding you to your ultimate destination, whether you choose to go there or not. There's fast travel too, right from the get-go. Secondly, the open design also means you can adventure at your own pace, if you'd like, with 6 regions, of which Limgrave is just one, being explorable in any order you choose. This freedom means you can level up, augment your weapons, take detours around a tough boss, anything, until you're ready to dive in. So in terms of simply exploring Elden Ring, From Software has made every effort to streamline its design for everyone. But that's not to say it's easy. There's no skirting around this next point. An open world it may now be, but the fact is Elden Ring is mechanically still closest in its DNA to Dark Souls. That is, in its challenge level and especially in its combat. Combat controls translate mostly unchanged from Dark Souls 3, though with a pinch of Sekiro in the form of a jump button and also a crouch mode for stealth. Otherwise, the lock-on system, the invincibility frames on side rolls, the careful metering out of stamina for light or heavy attacks, the guarding and dodging, it's all there. Even bonfires make a return, now named Sites of Grace, to let you respawn after death. And death. Death, there will be a lot of it. From the tree sentinel right at the start, To the flying dragon of the marshes, Elden Ring demands a keen eye for spotting attack patterns. Practice, anticipation, and reaction, none of which I appear to have in this footage. You will need it. And if not that, you'll face trap-filled dungeons, or even invading human players. Expect a firm challenge then. For the uninitiated, there's really no escaping it. You'll have to learn Elden Ring's controls, the rhythm of Souls combat, to rise to the challenge. Okay, so that's the setup. With all of this said, it's worth stressing as ever that this is a beta build. Parts of Limgrave are quite visibly blocked off, with a transparent wall appearing if I get too far off course. Also, on a technical level, From Software confirms a form of ray tracing is due in a patch, likely around launch. Insofar as how the network test build runs right now, there's also a considerable list of differences between PS5 and Xbox Series X. Much can change by the final release, but in many cases, well, it's the PS5 with an advantage. Let's kick off with resolution differences. All current gen consoles, even Series S, have a menu toggle to prioritize 60 FPS frame rate, or alternatively a quality mode to prioritize a 4K image. Here's PS5 as an example, but this applies to Series X too. With PS5's frame rate mode, you have dynamic resolution scaling in place that appears to target a full 3840 by 2160. In practice though, well, the frame rate mode usually runs between 1512p lowest, around the Stormhill gates for example, and 1800p in the best case exploring Limgrave. DRS is used in order to help it hit 60 FPS, which, to cut to the chase, PS5 still struggles to achieve. More on that later. The quality mode on the right side though is a simpler trade-off. It fixes the resolution more rigidly at 3840 by 2160 to give a crisp image, though with a huge hit to 60 FPS performance. Again, more to show on frame rates later. Shadow quality is boosted on the ground for quality mode, but other than that, impressively foliage density and draw is identical between the two modes. Effects, textures, even ambient occlusion are matched, while full screen and per object motion blur are enabled either way on PS5. Next, we have the Xbox Series X, and it's here we see a little twist. Again, the frame rate mode uses DRS to help it target 60 FPS. We notice it going down to 2688 by 1512 lowest, just like PS5, with a high of 1800p in less taxing scenes. On balance though, a majority of test samples come in at 1512p on Series X in this test build, often a lower raw pixel measurement than PS5 in my experience, though it's difficult to tell by eye. Our first encounter with Margit the Fell flags a PS5 advantage in pixel counts. It's not clear why, but again, this is an early build where each platform may see different levels of optimization. For a pure 4K image though, Series X's quality mode has parity. So here we have a practically fixed 3840 by 2160 pushed out just like PS5, though again at a big frame rate cost. There's another oddity with Series X worth touching on. The comparison between these two modes shows a big upgrade in resolution for quality mode of course, but you may notice something else. That motion blur is disabled outright on the frame rate mode. Per object and velocity based blurs only work on the quality mode for Xbox consoles. It's unlike PS5, which keeps blur enabled regardless of the mode selected, so it goes on Series S as well. The frame rate mode on Series S runs at around 1792 by 1008, but potentially with a target of 1440p at peak. Then there's the Series S quality mode, fixing itself at a true 2560 by 1440. Again though, we see blur only operates on the quality mode here. A bug, intentional, we'll have to see what the final game brings, but clearly there's an inconsistency between how the Xbox platforms work compared to PS5. In comparison, both PS5 and Series X are near identical in visual settings. For the frame rate mode for example, foliage density, the use of screen space reflections, the ambient occlusion type are all evenly matched here. The only key difference here is in the missing motion blur for Series X, which can give it a clearer image in movement slowed down. Otherwise, and putting the DRS differences aside, there's really little to split the two. For the quality mode, the differences are even more slight between PS5 and Series X, given motion blur is enabled either way. We're a lock. We get a native 4K image either side, matching foliage pop-in, and also the same higher shadow setting. Okay, next up, let's switch to a pure Xbox comparison. In fact, let's involve the last Gen 1X release here too. In a three-way split, Series S clearly uses visual settings on par with Series X, if at a lower 1440p target. Check out the leap in grass density over the last Gen 1X version. It really holds its own here. For the most rich presentation of Limgrave in core visual settings, you're ideally going to need a console from the new generation. Though, sadly, frame rates in this build are anything but a generational leap. All of which leads us right onto performance. There's a cause and effect here, a trade-off depending on which mode you use and which console you've hooked up. A heads up that really neither PS5, Series X or S can hold a solid 60fps in this test build, at least not running on the native apps. So let's kick off with PS5's performance mode, the frame rate mode. This is set by default once you boot Elden Ring, the idea being to sacrifice image quality for a 60fps lock. Except, well, it falls very short in its current state. We're more realistically looking at a range between 45 to 60fps depending on the scenario. Just walking through grass keeps it wavering at the mid to high 50s, fast travel by horseback past the castle gates pushes it down to 45fps, and likewise 45fps battling the flying dragon in the marshes. It's often touching the top 60fps line while on foot in smaller dungeons, but as it stands, Elden Ring can't quite lock down 60fps even in the mode designed specifically for it. Next up, what of the PS5 Quality Mode? This is a little more straightforward. DRS is disabled in this mode to give us that lovely 4K image, so the expectation is going in this would have a 30fps cap of some kind, but no, instead the frame rate's left to waver freely, unlocked up and down the graph. In effect, we have a low of 30fps in cutscenes, and a more typical frame rate at around 40fps. In other words, the game has potential to hit 60fps, but you'll rarely, if ever, catch a glimpse of it. I suppose the plus side here is that it never dips under 30fps. So if From Software were to add a 30fps cap for release to even out the consistency of frame rates, it would hold true to that number. But yes, as it presents right now, Elden Ring is struggling to perform well with 4K and 60fps as a target. Many of these performance drops on PS5 translate to Series X as well. Moving over to Series X, we have the same modes, but regardless of which one you pick, performance struggles with sub 60fps readings. Even the frame rate mode here more aggressively cuts into the low 50fps region just walking around Limgrave, a worse turnout than PS5 in this specific spot. Battles tug it down into the mid 40s too, and all round it's a surprise that despite Series X losing effects like motion blur, we're actually seeing worse performance as well in some spots. Here's a side-by-side to put it into perspective. Again, we have the frame rate mode on each side, and just emerging to Limgrave, walking down the grasslands towards the Tree Sentinel boss ahead, there's no question PS5 has a lead. That lead widens to 10fps when we move to the woodlands, a transparency-heavy area with only 3 enemies in view. It's not entirely clear, again, why Series X is falling behind in these slower moments. We see it in cutscenes too, frame matched to render the same image, despite there really being no difference in settings between them. Now, there are outliers which do favour Series X. Rapid traversal by horseback, for example, is consistently smoother. This entire route gives Series X a near 10fps lead of its own as we approach the carriage, and also approaching the flying dragon shows a consistent Series X lead. For a bulk of match play, it is PS5 with an advantage, but it's interesting to see that fortunes do change during fast movement. We'll have to see if this is true of the final game. The quality mode on Series X follows a similar pattern. 4K is simply too much for the systems to handle at 60 FPS, and the results are in effect closer to the 40 FPS line on Series X. If we put its quality mode in comparison with PS5, we even see it's outputting a lower FPS reading on average. It's a constant divide of 5 to 6 FPS in PS5's favour, and this even goes for cutscenes, like our introduction to Margit the Fell, with heavy smoke and dust effects plummeting both to the low 30s line. Even with VRR support to help on Series X, there's no question, this frame rate is too low. We need a 30 FPS cap for this mode on both machines ideally. That should be said for the Series S version as well. If we switch to Series S now, its frame rate mode runs worse still than PS5 and Series X equivalents. Series S in the frame rate mode gets you between 40 and 60 FPS, but realistically often sticks at the 50 FPS line. Inevitably switching over to the 1440p quality mode does it no favours. Down we go to just hovering above 30 FPS for most of play. It's just too much for the system. "60 FPS then. Elden Ring struggles to hit 60 FPS on any console and on any mode, except for one platform. PS5 has one solution thanks to its PS4 Pro back-compat support. Simply running the PS4 app instead of the native PS5 app means the game runs at settings intended for a PS4 Pro machine. So here we can get the game running at 3200 by 1800 with checkerboard rendering. 1800p reconstructed is still a lower pixel count than the PS5 release's 1512p to 4K range. In a three-way split showing all three options on a PS5 system, you can also see the difference in settings like foliage on the PS4 app. Grass is less dense, and the resolution hit gives it a softer appearance too. Still, visual sacrifices aside, this gives you a viable way to play Elden Ring at a practically locked 60 FPS. It's an option Xbox Series X or S sadly did not have at their disposal for the network test. For PS5 owners, you might want to consider it, if you can accept the visual cutbacks, if you prioritise 60 FPS above all else. A final test on loading times. Rapid loading speeds are especially crucial for Elden Ring. After all, you'll die and respawn to sites of grace frequently, as with Dark Souls, which takes time. But now fast travel between sites of grace is more imperative than ever for getting around, which again takes time. So tested on all three machines, there's one key takeaway here. PS5 trumps both Xbox versions in loading speeds. For the beta at least, every equivalent test on PS5 comes in at around half the time of Series X or S. Fast travelling from the Castlewood Tunnel right back to the first step, PS5 hits 6.6 seconds up against 11.8 on Series X. It happens consistently for any respawning and travel. PS5 is just currently quicker to load in new areas. Elden Ring's early network test is just one piece of a much larger puzzle, but signs so far are promising. There's hopefully more optimizations to come, especially so looking at PS5 and Series X frame rate modes. But regardless of console, the quality is there. Elden Ring gives a unique freedom to do what you like, to tackle objectives in any order you choose, while also still retaining that brutal Dark Souls edge. PS5 is looking in the best shape right now, especially with the option of that PS4 Pro app to achieve 60 FPS if you'd like, but there's much more to consider here. Elden Ring is very much a cross-gen project, and so I'll be back with a second run of tests on PS4, Xbox One, and Pro and One X in due course. Watch this space. But that's all I have for today. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch with myself or the rest of the team, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.